The summer of 1950 in Korea was a powder keg, ready to explode. For years, the peninsula had been a divided land, a scar left by the end of World War II. North of the 38th parallel, a communist government, backed by the Soviet Union, was digging in its heels. South of it, a fledgling democracy, leaning on American support, struggled to find its footing. Tensions were a constant, a low hum beneath the surface of daily life, but most believed it would stay that way. A cold standoff, not a hot war. America's involvement was mostly advisory, a presence meant to stabilize, not to fight. The belief was that any conflict would be contained, a proxy skirmish at best. No one truly expected the storm that was brewing. Enter Lieutenant James Thompson. He was young, barely out of officer training, with a fresh face and a head full of ideals. Korea was his first deployment, a chance to put his training to good use, to serve his country in a time of Cold War uncertainty. He'd joined the army not just for adventure, but with a genuine belief in freedom and democracy. He pictured himself helping build a stable South Korea, maybe even teaching some local kids English in his downtime. His letters home spoke of optimism, of the beauty of the Korean countryside, and the friendliness of the people he met. He was part of a unit that had arrived in the early months of 1950, tasked with supporting the South Korean military, observing and preparing. Their days were filled with drills, patrols, and the mundane routines of military life, all under the assumption that their presence was a deterrent, not a prelude to battle. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning in June, the world turned upside down. The North Korean People's Army, heavily armed and well-trained, launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. It was sudden, brutal, and overwhelming. South Korean defenses crumbled almost instantly, caught completely off guard. The United Nations forces, largely unprepared for such an onslaught, found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. Thompson's unit, stationed near the initial invasion routes, was thrown into the chaos without warning. The idyllic image of Korea he'd held was shattered by the sound of artillery and the sight of endless columns of enemy troops. This wasn't a contained skirmish. This was a war, and they were right in the middle of it. The initial thrust was merciless. Thompson's unit found itself in a series of desperate rearguard actions, trying to slow the North Korean advance and protect retreating South Korean civilians and soldiers. The fighting was intense, a relentless wave of enemy forces pushing them back, day after day. Casualties mounted quickly, and the lines of communication frayed, then snapped. Orders became garbled, then non-existent. In the confusion, during a particularly brutal engagement near a small, unnamed village, Thompson and a small group of his men found themselves cut off. They had been trying to cover a retreat, laying down suppressive fire, when the main force pulled back faster than expected. One moment, they were part of a larger unit. The next, they were alone, surrounded, the sound of enemy voices closing in from all sides. The world had shrunk to the few yards around them, and the only certainty was the immediate danger. They were trapped, isolated, and the storm had definitely broken. The small group, led by Lieutenant Thompson, knew their situation was grim. They were behind enemy lines, deep in territory now controlled by the North Koreans. Evasion was their only option. They moved mostly at night, sticking to the dense forests and rugged hills, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the last known enemy positions. Days blurred into a grueling routine of constant vigilance. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They scavenged for whatever they could find, wild berries, roots, sometimes a stray chicken if they were lucky, but hunger was a constant companion. Water was equally scarce, often found in muddy puddles or trickling streams. The psychological toll was immense. Each man carried a heavy burden of fear and exhaustion. Sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford, snatched in short, restless bursts while one of them kept watch. Thompson tried to keep morale up, sharing what little food they had, whispering words of encouragement, and reminding them of their training. He spoke of linking up with other UN forces, of returning to their lines, even though deep down he knew the odds were stacked against them. The hope he projected was as much for himself as it was for his men. They were hunted, and the constant awareness of being pursued, of being an outsider in a hostile land, slowly chipped away at their resolve. The familiar world had vanished, replaced by a brutal, primitive struggle for survival. Their desperate measures, however, could only last so long. After nearly a week of evading patrols and moving through unfamiliar terrain, their luck ran out. It happened near a small river where they had stopped to refill their canteens. A North Korean patrol, larger and better equipped than any they had encountered, emerged from the tree line. There was no time to react, no chance to fight their way out. The odds were overwhelming. Thompson and his men, weakened by hunger and fatigue, were quickly surrounded. The shock of capture was immediate and brutal. The world, which had felt so vast and dangerous just moments before, now shrunk to the menacing faces of their captors. The uncertainty of what came next was terrifying, but the loss of freedom, the sudden absolute control exerted by others, was a feeling Thompson would never forget. The immediate aftermath was harsh. They were stripped of their weapons, their identification tags, and any personal belongings deemed useful by the soldiers. Rough hands pushed and shoved them, and sharp words, in a language they didn't understand, were barked at them. It was a stark introduction to the reality of being a prisoner. They were marched at gunpoint, forced to keep pace with their captors, even as their bodies screamed in protest. The destination was a temporary holding area, a collection of makeshift tents and barbed wire in a bombed-out village. There, Thompson saw other prisoners, a mix of South Korean soldiers and a few other Americans, all with the same dazed, defeated look in their eyes. The grim reality of their situation sank in with every passing hour. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was a new, terrifying chapter. Back in the chaos of the retreating UN forces, Thompson's name initially appeared on hastily compiled POW lists. Reports from units that had managed to escape the encirclement mentioned his group being cut off. His family back home received the dreaded telegram, "Missing in action." But then, just as quickly as his name appeared, it vanished. The initial reports were confused, often contradictory. As the front lines shifted and the military tried to account for the thousands of missing men, Thompson's status became unclear. There was no further information, no confirmation of his capture from official channels. His unit, fractured and reorganized, had little to go on. His family, clinging to the hope that he was alive, began the agonizing process of trying to ascertain his whereabouts, making desperate calls and writing letters, only to be met with official silence and the chilling phrase, "unaccounted for." It was as if Lieutenant James Thompson had simply disappeared into the fog of war. The initial holding area was just the beginning of Thompson's ordeal. After a few days of sparse rations and cramped conditions, he and a group of other American and South Korean prisoners were prepared for a longer, much more arduous journey north. The destination, though unspoken, was understood to be deeper into North Korean territory, to a more permanent prisoner of war camp. The journey itself was a brutal test of endurance. They marched for days, sometimes weeks, through rugged mountains and dense forests. Food was scarce, often just a handful of rice or a watery soup once a day. Water was even scarcer, forcing them to drink from muddy puddles or contaminated streams, which quickly led to widespread dysentery. Medical care was non-existent. Wounded prisoners, those who had been injured during their capture or fell ill during the march, were simply left behind to die or sometimes shot. Thompson witnessed men collapse from exhaustion, their bodies giving out under the relentless pace and lack of sustenance. The guards, often young and hardened by war, showed little to no compassion. They were driven by a harsh ideology and saw their prisoners as enemies, not fellow human beings. This forced march was designed to break their spirit, to wear them down both physically and mentally. Thompson watched the light fade from the eyes of his fellow prisoners, saw their hope dwindle with each painful step. The constant threat of violence, the gnawing hunger, and the sight of comrades perishing around him etched deep scars into his mind. He clung to a sliver of defiance, a quiet resolve not to give in, no matter how bleak things became. Eventually, the endless march brought them to a place that would forever be seared into Thompson's memory, a prisoner of war camp nestled deep in a remote valley. The prisoners quickly dubbed it the Valley of Death. It was a collection of rudimentary barracks, surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers. The conditions were appalling. Overcrowding was rampant, with dozens of men crammed into small, unheated huts. Disease spread like wildfire. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery were constant companions. The meager rations made starvation a daily reality, and many prisoners succumbed to malnutrition. The systematic attempts at indoctrination began almost immediately. Guards and political officers would lecture them for hours, trying to break down their beliefs and replace them with communist propaganda. They were told America was a warmongering nation, that they were fighting for a corrupt cause, and that their own government had abandoned them. Thompson, like many others, fought hard to maintain his sense of self. He found small ways to resist. He would mentally recite the names of his family, recall details of his life back home, anything to keep his mind sharp and his memories intact. Secret communication networks formed among the prisoners. Whispered words exchanged during forced labor details or late at night in the barracks. They shared news, rumors, and sometimes just a word of encouragement. These small acts of solidarity, a shared glance of understanding, became lifelines in the suffocating environment. They were attempts to reclaim a small piece of their humanity in a place designed to strip it away. The complete lack of contact with the outside world was one of the cruelest aspects of their captivity. Letters were never delivered, and incoming news was heavily censored or fabricated. The gnawing uncertainty about the war's progress, about whether their families knew they were alive, was a constant torment. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and the outside world felt increasingly distant, a faint memory. The fear of being forgotten, of simply vanishing without a trace, grew with each passing day. Thompson often stared at the distant peaks surrounding the valley, wondering if anyone was looking for them, if anyone remembered their names. The silence was heavy, a constant reminder of their isolation, a weight that pressed down on their spirits. As the war dragged on, the initial rapid advances and retreats gave way to a brutal stalemate. The battle lines solidified, and the conflict became a grinding war of attrition. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the prospect of a swift victory faded for everyone. With neither side able to decisively defeat the other, peace talks slowly began, haltingly at first, then gaining a fragile momentum. In these negotiations, the fate of prisoners of war gained increasing importance. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They became bargaining chips, human currency in a high-stakes diplomatic game. The United Nations Command, representing the Allied forces, began the painstaking process of trying to account for every missing serviceman, a task made incredibly difficult by the chaos of the early war and the secretive nature of their adversaries. Deep inside the Valley of Death, Thompson continued his grim struggle for survival. He was thinner, weaker, but his resolve remained. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in the guards' attitudes, their moods often reflecting the changing tides of the war. When negotiations seemed to stall, the guards became harsher, their treatment more severe. When there was a hint of progress, a slight easing of tension could be felt, though it was always fleeting. Thompson, ever the soldier, tried to gather what little intelligence he could, observing patterns, listening to snippets of conversation, piecing together fragments of information that might one day be useful. These small acts of mental engagement were vital, keeping his mind active and preventing the apathy that consumed so many. Then came the news, whispered through the camp like a fragile hope. Prisoner exchanges were beginning. These were initial, limited repatriations, often of the sick and wounded, designed to test the waters of negotiation. For the men in the camp, these exchanges brought a mix of intense hope and crushing despair. Every time a list of names was read, a wave of anticipation would sweep through the barracks, followed by a profound silence for those left behind. Thompson listened intently each time, his heart a silent drum. but his name was never called. His absence from these early lists deepened the mystery surrounding his fate, signaling that his situation might be more complicated than a simple capture. As the war continued to simmer in the background of diplomatic talks, a new, insidious element began to emerge. Propaganda. Rumors started to circulate, both inside and outside the camps, about American POWs who had supposedly chosen to stay in North Korea, or even defected to the communist side. These whispers were carefully cultivated by the captors, designed to sow doubt and division, to undermine the morale of the remaining prisoners and their families back home. The official stance of the U.S. military was one of strong denial, emphasizing that American soldiers would not willingly betray their country. However, the very existence of these rumors, amplified by the information vacuum, further complicated the search for missing personnel like Thompson. It created a shadow of suspicion, making it harder for his family and the authorities to discern the truth. Was he still alive? Was he being held secretly? Or had he, as the insidious propaganda suggested, made a choice that would forever alter his legacy? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered and terrifying. The armistice agreement, signed on July 27, 1953, finally brought a halt to the fighting in Korea. For many, it was a moment of immense relief, a ceasefire after 3 years of brutal conflict. Operation Big Switch and Little Switch soon followed, meticulously organized prisoner repatriation efforts designed to return captured soldiers to their respective sides. Images of gaunt but smiling servicemen stepping off planes filled newspapers and newsreels, bringing joy and a sense of closure to countless families. But for others, the armistice, rather than bringing an end to their pain, only deepened it. Lieutenant James Thompson's name, devastatingly, was not on any of the official repatriation lists. As the last of the known prisoners returned, the hope that had flickered for so long in his family's hearts began to dim. His official status shifted, first from missing in action to the more somber, presumed dead, and later, for administrative purposes, to missing in action, unaccounted for. This bureaucratic terminology, while necessary for military records, offered no comfort. For his parents, his wife and his young son, it was an open wound, a constant ache of not knowing. The absence of a body, a grave, or even a definitive account of his final moments left them in a cruel limbo, unable to fully grieve or move on. The profound impact of his disappearance rippled through their community, a stark reminder of the war's enduring cost. Immediately after the armistice, the United States government launched extensive efforts to account for every missing serviceman. Specialized committees were formed, intelligence-gathering operations intensified, and countless reports were sifted through. The goal was to bring every soldier home, or at least provide definitive answers to their families. However, these efforts were plagued by limitations. The political climate of the Cold War meant North Korea remained largely inaccessible, a closed society unwilling to cooperate fully. Records were incomplete or non-existent, and the chaos of the war meant many details were lost forever. The frustrations faced by these committees were immense, often leading to dead ends and inconclusive findings. Despite the official pronouncements and the dwindling hope, a growing number of families refused to accept the official narrative of their loved ones' disappearance. They wouldn't believe that their sons, husbands, and fathers had simply vanished without a trace. These families, driven by an unshakable love and a desperate need for answers, began to share stories. Anecdotal evidence, often dismissed by official channels, started to emerge. Unverified sightings of American-looking men in remote areas of North Korea, whispered accounts from defectors, and strange messages smuggled out of the communist bloc fueled their conviction that some POWs might still be alive, held in secret, forgotten prisons. These seeds of doubt were powerful. They challenged the government's narrative and kept the hope, however faint, alive for families like the Thompsons. If other families had heard similar whispers, if there were even a slim chance, then James might still be out there. This refusal to accept official closure became a quiet but powerful movement, driven by personal grief and a shared sense of injustice. The armistice had ended the war, but for these families, the battle for truth had just begun, a battle that would stretch on for decades. The Cold War's grip tightened around the globe, and nowhere was its effect more pronounced than on the Korean peninsula. North Korea, a newly formed communist state, pulled its curtains shut, becoming an impenetrable fortress of secrecy. Information, already scarce during the war, now became almost impossible to obtain. This iron curtain of silence made the search for missing servicemen like Lieutenant James Thompson a monumental task. Intelligence agencies, both American and Allied, worked tirelessly, sifting through scraps of information, interrogating defectors, and analyzing propaganda, all in a desperate attempt to piece together the truth. But every lead seemed to dissolve into the dense fog of Cold War politics and deliberate obfuscation. Yet despite the formidable barriers, stories began to emerge, whispered like ghosts from behind the curtain. Repatriated prisoners, those who had made it back during the exchanges, sometimes spoke of seeing other Americans in unexpected places, in facilities not officially recognized as POW camps. These were often fleeting glances, names overheard, or faces glimpsed in passing, but they were enough to ignite a flicker of hope. Defectors, risking everything to escape North Korea, occasionally brought fragmented accounts of hidden camps, of Western prisoners held under conditions different from the known POW system. Some accounts, though unconfirmed and often garbled by time and trauma, seemed to align with the general profile or circumstances of men like Thompson, officers, pilots, or those captured early in the war. The challenge, always, was verification. These eyewitness accounts were often delayed, coming years after the events, and were almost impossible to corroborate with hard evidence from a closed society. For Lieutenant Thompson, these elusive reports painted a picture of several potential fates. One theory suggested he had simply died in captivity, perhaps from disease, malnutrition, or unrecorded wounds, his body buried in an unmarked grave, lost to history. This was a grim but common reality for many prisoners. Another, more unsettling theory was that he had been transferred to a hidden camp, perhaps deemed valuable for his rank or knowledge. Such camps were rumored to exist, used for intelligence gathering, or even as bargaining chips in a deeper, more secret geopolitical game. Could Thompson have been held for his perceived intelligence value, kept isolated and off the books? A third possibility, equally disturbing, was that he had been forced to remain in North Korea, either due to severe health issues that made repatriation impossible or, more sinisterly, due to political reasons. Perhaps coerced into collaboration or simply deemed too much of an intelligence asset to release. Thompson's family, fueled by these fragmented reports and their own unyielding love, refused to surrender to despair. His parents, now older and wearier, continued their relentless advocacy. They wrote countless letters to congressmen, petitioned the State Department, and met with military officials, their voices clear and firm in their demand for answers. His wife, who had remarried but never truly let go of the past, joined them in their quest, her own son now grown, and asking questions about the father he never knew. They launched their own quiet investigations, reaching out to veterans groups, former prisoners, and anyone who might have a scrap of information. Their unwavering belief that James might still be alive, or at least that his true fate could be uncovered, became a powerful, quiet force. They were not just fighting for one man, they were fighting for the truth, for every family left in the agonizing limbo of not knowing. The Cold War curtain might have been thick, but their hope was thicker still. The decades peeled away, one after another, since the armistice was signed, yet no definitive answers about Lieutenant Thompson's fate ever surfaced. The initial flurry of post-armistice investigations eventually slowed to a trickle, then to a near-complete halt. His parents, once vibrant and full of fight, grew frail with age, their voices softer, their pleas tinged with a deep, weary sadness. The vivid memories of their son, the boy who went off to war, began to blur around the edges, replaced by the persistent, aching void he left behind. Other family members, friends and comrades who knew him either passed away or moved on with their lives, their recollections of James fading with each passing year. Still, a stubborn core of organizations dedicated to accounting for POW MIAs from all conflicts kept his file, and thousands like it, open, refusing to let the cases gather dust. Periodically, a glimmer of hope would appear in the form of declassified documents. These were often old intelligence reports, once top secret, now released to the public after decades. They came from various governments, sometimes American, sometimes from allied nations, and occasionally, even from former adversaries, though records from North Korea remained virtually non-existent. These documents might contain a fleeting mention of a captured American officer fitting Thompson's description, or details about a camp that was previously unknown. A list of POWs from a specific date, a guard's diary entry, or an aerial reconnaissance photo might hint at something. But these findings were frustratingly inconclusive. They rarely provided a clear, undeniable link to Thompson, offering only tantalizing fragments that raised more questions than they answered. Each declassification brought a surge of hope, quickly followed by the familiar ache of disappointment when no concrete breakthrough emerged. The human cost of this enduring silence was immense. For Thompson's family, the lack of closure was a wound that never truly healed. His mother carried the weight of his absence until her last breath, always holding on to a sliver of hope, always scanning faces in crowds, always wondering. His wife, even after building a new life, lived with a phantom limb of grief, a constant reminder of the life they were supposed to have. The son he never met grew up with a photograph and whispered stories, forever marked by the unknown fate of his father. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a societal one. The unresolved POW/MIA cases from Korea and other wars left a lingering scar on the nation's psyche, raising enduring questions about responsibility, accountability, and the promises made to those who serve. The what-ifs haunted those who remembered him. What if he had taken a different path on that fateful day? What if his unit hadn't been cut off? What if he had been repatriated in an earlier exchange? Each what-if spun a different version of his life, a life he never got to live. He could have come home, raised his son, grown old with his wife, pursued his dreams. Instead, his life became a question mark, a blank space in the tapestry of countless lives. The impact of his disappearance rippled outwards, touching not only his immediate family, but also friends, comrades, and even strangers who heard his story. His personal trajectory was tragically cut short, and the lives of those around him were forever altered, shaped by the gnawing uncertainty of his fate. The silence that enveloped James Thompson was not empty. It was heavy with unspoken words, unfulfilled dreams, and the endless echoes of a war that refused to truly end for some. The story of Lieutenant James Thompson, lost in the Korean War, has become more than just a personal tragedy. It's a powerful symbol. He represents the thousands of American servicemen who vanished without a trace in that conflict, their fates unknown, their families left in perpetual limbo. His case, like so many others, embodies the enduring mystery and the profound human cost of war, a conflict that, for many, never truly ended. It's a stark reminder that even after peace treaties are signed, battles continue in the hearts and minds of those left behind. Today, organizations like the DPAA, the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, continue their tireless work. They are the torchbearers of a solemn promise, to account for every missing American service member, no matter how much time has passed. Their teams scour old battlefields, analyze historical documents, and use cutting-edge forensic science to bring answers, sometimes decades later. The occasional identification of remains, often through DNA analysis, offers a bittersweet closure to families who have waited a lifetime. A bone fragment, a dog tag, a dental record. These small pieces of evidence can finally connect a name to a soldier, allowing them to be brought home and laid to rest with honor. Yet for every success, there are still countless names on the missing lists, a sobering statistical reality that underscores the vastness of the challenge. Thousands from the Korean War alone remain unaccounted for, their stories incomplete. The central question surrounding Lieutenant James Thompson remains: what really happened to him? Did he die in a forgotten skirmish, his body lost to the rugged Korean terrain? Was he a prisoner in a secret camp, held beyond the reach of any official lists? Did he succumb to disease, starvation, or mistreatment in a harsh POW facility, buried in an unmarked grave? The truth, in all likelihood, is probably far less dramatic than the desperate hopes and fears that have fueled the speculation for so long. He was a young man caught in the brutal maelstrom of war, and in such chaos, lives are extinguished and records are lost with terrifying ease. We may never have a definitive answer, a clear narrative that explains his final moments. The fog of war, in his case, has never truly lifted. But the importance of his story isn't diminished by the lack of a clear ending. It's precisely the unanswered questions that make his legacy so poignant. Lieutenant Thompson's story, and the stories of all the missing, serve as a powerful call to remember. They remind us of the immense sacrifices made by those who serve and the heavy price paid by their families. It's a commitment deeply ingrained in the nation's conscience to never forget and to never stop striving for answers. Every effort to find a missing service member, every analysis of an old photograph, every excavation of a forgotten site, is a testament to this enduring commitment. Thompson's fate, while unknown, is not forgotten. His name, etched on memorials and whispered in family histories, continues to resonate. His life, cut short and shrouded in mystery, is a poignant reminder of the enduring human impact of war, a stark testament to the fact that for some, the conflict never truly ends. It's a story that continues to compel us, decades later, to reflect on the nature of heroism, sacrifice, and the unwavering hope for closure. And as long as there are missing service members, the search will continue, driven by the memory of men like Lieutenant James Thompson.